So moving on now to video number 2, where I want to talk just about something that's been on my mind lately, and it's about the word neurotypical. So the word neurotypical originally was used to describe people who aren't autistic. It was quite a narrow kind of definition, if you will. Neurotypical was to describe people who are not autistic, or people who, I guess, if you wanted to broaden it out a little bit, you could say anyone who's not autistic or doesn't have, say, an intellectual disability. But usually the definition was more narrow. It was like someone who isn't autistic. The reason being is that autism is a pervasive neurodevelopmental condition. So it literally affects every area of a person's life. It doesn't just affect one area, it affects all areas of a person's life to a greater or lesser extent. So obviously in autism, the kind of core of autism, if you like, is a social disability, in the sense that if you're autistic, right from birth, you struggle to interact with other people. This is obviously most apparent in childhood, because as you grow older, depending on the type of autism you have, obviously some people never achieve this, but many autistics, as you get older, learn to accommodate yourself to some extent with the rest of society, and so some of these social problems aren't quite so obvious or quite so manifest, although that's not to say that they can still be incredibly disabling. It's just that they're not quite so obvious, if you get what I'm saying, because as you get older you can learn how to kind of find strategies to deal with them to a greater or lesser extent. Obviously some autistics can never achieve that, particularly if they have an intellectual disability on top, and then it can be an impossibility, and they're always going to be very, very, very obviously socially disabled. But other autistics might be able to kind of provide strategies that kind of being like a social disability is less apparent to others, but obviously it can still be very, very, very hindering for the person themselves. It's still very, very, very disabling. But anyway, so the social side is, if you like, the crux of autism, but it doesn't just involve social. Obviously, autism affects everything. It literally affects your whole being. So, like, the whole brain is essentially different. It doesn't just affect one part of the brain, it literally affects the whole of the brain. You're literally all wired up differently. So obviously that's going to affect everything in your life, basically, and means that your way of being in a world is obviously going to be very different to someone who's not autistic. So that was how the word neurotypical was originally designed, was originally coined. That's a better way of putting it, isn't it? That was originally how the word neurotypical was originally coined, was to draw a distinction between someone with a pervasive neurodevelopmental condition, basically autism, and maybe at a slightly more looser definition, that might also include people with intellectual disabilities. Obviously intellectual disabilities are very different to autism, but they're also pervasive, but obviously in a different way, from like neurotypicals, who are like the typical people in society who don't have a pervasive developmental condition. Now what's happened lately is there's been a kind of loosening of the term. And this in a way connects to my earlier video when I was talking about the broader idea of neurodiversity and how it's kind of now become a very loose kind of spectrum idea, which has lost all sort of scientific medical plausibility. So do go and check that other video out if you haven't seen it already. But now what's happened is that the word neurotypical has now become much more narrow, and it's now used just to describe anyone who doesn't have any neurological difference. So basically, if you're dyslexic, if you have dyscalculia, if you have ADHD, if you have dyspraxia, I think they're the main ones, if you have Tourette's, even sometimes some mental health conditions are included, believe it or not, like OCD. But anyway, if you have any of those conditions, you're not neurotypical, regardless of whether or not you also have autism. I feel that's kind of wrong, because I sort of feel like I sort of feel that the word neurotypical should really be used in its original sense, which is to describe anyone who's not autistic, as simple as not autistic, or not, or at least not not autistic. I mean, some people say it should literally just be for those who aren't autistic because of a pervasive aspect. Because obviously, even someone with an intellectual disability who's not autistic will still be able to socialise with the world, even if they have problems in other areas. But because autism hits at the heart of what it is to be in a world as a human being, which is essentially to have social skills, and because autism is essentially attacks those very fundamental core skills that are so essential to being a human being, essentially, and if you lack those skills, are incredibly disabling on a kind of connective level. That was why originally neurotypicals were simply those people without autism. But nowadays we're having this far more looser definition of what is a neurotypical, and now people without, and now it only includes a very small pool of people who literally don't have any developmental condition, which I personally don't like, because I feel it's kind of, the end result is that it ends up trivialising what autism is, and also suggesting an affiliation in terms of the needs and interests of autistic people with what I would call neurotypical people with diversities. By that I mean, neurotypical people with diversities, I would include anyone with dyslexia, dyscalculia, ADHD, dyspraxia. So all of those types of people, groups of people who have a developmental condition but aren't autistic, I would describe as being neurotypical people with diversities. In other words, they're essentially neurotypical because they don't have a pervasive developmental condition, and they can still socialise fine with other people. Their social skills are intact, and obviously if your social skills are intact, then no matter what other disability you have, you still are at a comparative advantage, say, with someone who's autistic. So I would say that these people are neurotypical people with diversities, or neurodiverse neurotypicals, which sounds a bit like an oxymoron, like surely, that's like almost saying that surely diverse isn't typical sort of thing. But I don't think it is an oxymoron, because all it says is that you can be both in the mainstream, as in quite average and normal in most stuff, but have a kind of quirk, a slight deviation from the rest. So you're still broadly speaking neurotypical, you just have a diversity, if you will. So you're a neurodiverse neurotypical, which would be, say, someone with dyslexia, for example. Whereas an autistic person is not neurotypical at all. Because to put it like this, when I'm in a company of someone who has a slight, for example, a learning difference, who is not autistic, essentially I'm with someone who's neurotypical but has a slight difference, say, in reading or writing or another particular academic skill. To me, that person is still basically neurotypical, and my needs are not the same as theirs, which is another reason why I feel that it's wrong to lump all the conditions together into a neurodiversity spectrum. And I just feel it's becoming increasingly loose and woolly, and I feel that it's leading to a kind of lack of scientific rigour and a lack of kind of medical verisimilitude, if you want to call it that. And that really annoys me, because I sort of feel that we need to have firmer ideas about what these conditions entail. And by kind of broadening out the idea of what is not neurotypical, if you like, you end up with only a very small minority of people who are in fact neurotypical, which, basically you end up with, so in other words, you end up, because if you were to include all of the neurodevelopmental conditions, you end up with actually almost 50-50. I mean, it's obviously still a minority, but it's a very, very large minority. Again, you start to think, well, who is actually typical? But I just feel it's more simple to describe people who aren't autistic as neurotypical, regardless of what other conditions they might have. I just feel that makes sense to me, but I know this is a contentious issue. I think in my instance, I just feel that essentially it trivialises autism by suggesting that there's a parity between autism and conditions that only affect part of a person's brain as opposed to the whole of the brain. And that, say for example, someone who's dyslexic or ADHD but not autistic basically doesn't share the same needs as someone with autism, and if they don't have autism but they just have one of those conditions, their life might still be very difficult and they might be still pretty disabled, and I'm not denying these conditions can be very disabling for the people who have them. But you just cannot compare that with autism, and I just feel that basically if you have your social skills intact, you are basically a typical person, regardless of any other differences you have, because I feel that social skills are where it's at, and if you have social skills, no matter what other problems you have, you basically are at an advantage compared to someone who doesn't have social skills, is what I'm saying. So do let me know what you think, and your views on the neurotypicality debate, whether it should literally just apply to people who aren't autistic, or whether we need a more looser definition of neurotypical to include anyone who doesn't have any neurodevelopmental condition whatsoever, which will make the net far wider. But do let me know what you think. Okay, so thank you for watching.